Okay, so today's we're looking at non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cynarae. Doubt my pronunciation on any of that is correct, but yeah. So it's by Ernest Dowson, and I'm just starting off with some ideas of some questions which you might like to ask yourself when considering this poem to aid in your revision or analysis. I'm not going to go through them directly, they're just some things that you might want to think about as you are watching this video. Now I'm afraid I'm going to start with some explanation which doesn't have a visual aid, and I do apologise for that, but I've got everything on paper and I didn't want to type it all up, but I will be making some notes about what I'm saying, so I'll try not to make it too boring. But first of all, so you've got the decadent. Looking at the decadent movement, which is what Ernest Dowson was a part of. The decadent movement came during the Victorian era, and it was the late Victorian era, mainly the 1890s, and it combined a tendency towards sexual promiscuity with an appreciation of classical literature, including mythology and a devotion to the Catholic faith. So they believed that art should celebrate beauty, sorry, typing and speaking at the same time isn't my best skill. They had influence from the Gothic, which had been mainly late Romantic, but some in the Victorian era as well. They were also influenced by Romanticism and by the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which I'm not going to cover. So the decadents, using it as a noun, were generally considered people who were luxuriously self-indulgent. They embraced partying, they embraced drugs, they alarmed those who valued the traditional norms of society, because they seemed to threaten society and culture. Now, the poem was published in 1894, so when the decadent movement was quite popular, and it was written 6 years before Edward Dowson died. He died in 1900, aged only 32. Unfortunately, a lot of poets seem to die young. So he took the title from book 4 of Horace's Odes, and the translation of the title is "I am not as I was under good Cynarae's reign." Sorry, I don't know why my font keeps reverting away from Arial. But although that's where the title comes from, in Book 4 of Horace's Odes, the character of Cynarae is almost non-existent. Whereas in the poem, she is the subject. And Dowson chooses to make her the focal point of his poem, crafting a poem about unforgettable love. He employs the extravagant language and the sinful indulgence, which characterise the decadent movement, and portrays inability to love as acutely painful. Now, it's thought that this was inspired by Dowson's own experience of forbidden love. So Dowson met Adelaide, Fulton the Wicks, when he was 23 and she was 11. So she was the daughter of a restaurant owner who lived near the Dowson's family, and Dowson became completely infatuated with her. He actually proposed marriage, and was rejected because which haunted Dowson, especially when Adelaide then went on to marry another man. But Dowson never seemed to forget Adelaide, and many scholars speculate that she is the inspiration behind this poem, which has been described as obsessive. So we'll look briefly at the poem and go through the next bit. So the first stanza of the poem, the speaker addresses his former love, Cynarae. Though he has tried to forget her and move on, he feels unable to do this. Although he tries to take another lover, the shadow of Cynarae falls between them. He cannot bring himself to be the person he was before he met Cynarae, because he is desolate and sick of an old passion, and suggests that he is quite literally lovesick. The speaker's obsessive love for Cynarae prevents him from living his life to the fuller, and he can rid himself of it. By being linked to lovesickness, it almost suggests that love is a disease. The last line of the stanza is repeated throughout the poem and declares that despite any new love affairs the speaker may engage in, his heart will always remain faithful to Cynarae, meaning that he is faithful in his passion. Stanza 2. So the second stanza contains a description of the speaker's lover, who he had for a one-night stand, and he reflects on her kisses, but ultimately remains lovesick and unable to cope with his longing for Cynarae. This is especially when he wakes in the morning and nothing has changed his feelings. The idea of bought red mouth suggests prostitution, and there is an unapologetic suggestion of immorality, which is characteristic of writers in the decadent movement. So the third stanza contains the line, I have forgot much, Cynarae gone with the wind, and that reference to Gone with the Wind is actually where the title of the book came from. So it inspired the title of Margaret Mitchell's famous novel. This stanza is the speaker describing how he's tried to distract himself, and just yet he is unable to, and Cynarae remains in his thoughts. Then we have the final stanza. Fourth and final stanza. One of Dowson's the speaker describes having indulged in life's pleasures, calling for ever madder music and stronger wine. But when the merriment is over, the lights are extinguished, his longing for Cynarae returns, so he is still unable to distract himself. The tense shifts in the final stanza, showing that he is still desolate and sick of old passion. It's no longer in the past tense, and it illustrates the never-ending nature of his longing. Cynarae has haunted him in the past and continues to do so. The regular line screen throughout the poem reinforces the idea of love that is constant and unchanging, and the use of repetition signifies the speaker's inability to move on from both Cynarae and the self-abuse that he's doing in his methods of distraction. So I've just got it's worth noting that Dowson has significant French influence in his poetry. He was educated in France, and his 12-syllable lines, sometimes known as the Alexandrine, are typical of French poetry rather than English. Okay, so this is a poem itself, which clearly I've just talked about in a slightly descriptive way, which would not be suitable for an exam. In fact, it's one of the things which on the examiner's reports is noted that weaker candidates tend to describe rather than analyse. So it's really important to try and analyse rather than tell the story of the poem. And it can be quite hard sometimes with this sort of poem because it's got quite a narrative. I find that especially with feminine gospels, that you have to remember that you're not just retelling the narrative story of each poem. So I'm going to make a few points. I'm going to try and make 3 points per stanza, and then obviously you can see that I've got a few other ideas which are done in my annotations, which you can read through if you want to. So starting in the first stanza, Dowson is using archaic language. Yesternight, betwixt, thy, it's all archaic, and generally archaic language is thought to be romantic. So he's being romantic, but he's also being old-fashioned, and I think especially yesternight and betwixt are almost excessively archaic, and had been archaic for at least 300 years by this time. So he's clearly using that deliberately, and it does create an emotional tone. It's reflective because he's looking back, but that classical illusion could be seen actually as suggesting that he's not 100% serious, or in that is a sign of the decadent movement. He starts by addressing Cynarae, and I don't know why it's spelt with just the A's inside the poem, but in the title you've got the E. I don't know why, but that's how it is in my copy, so that's what I've put on here. And you'll notice that throughout the poem, every time he mentions Cynarae, I don't actually know if that's how you say it, but that's how I've been saying it, he always uses an exclamation mark, which is a type of punctuation. And by doing that, emphasises his love for her as passionate, but also it breaks the rhythm up because it's caesura, and by breaking the rhythm up, Dowson sort of implies that his love for her is non-natural, and sort of implies that she is disrupting his life, and his love of her is disrupting his life. And then we've got the beginning of the refrain. So it features in this stanza and all the others. I was desolate and sick of an old passion. I have been faithful to thee, Cynarae, in my fashion. And what that's saying, in my fashion, is effectively, I read that as an admission that he's not being faithful to her, suggesting that he is, in fact, being unfaithful, and that's backed up by the fact that he was sleeping with someone else last night, and a lot of his coping strategies introduce the kisses and the wine. Then we've got move into the second stanza. Mine heart, I felt her warm heart beat within mine arms. Quite traditional love imagery, suggesting intimacy. But you've got the contrast between bought red mouth and the dawn that was grey, suggesting that though she was fulfilling, we are presuming that she's a prostitute, though it was fulfilling in the moment when he woke up the next morning, the contrast between grey and red suggests that she is nothing compared to Cynarae, and that it's transitory anyway. We also have the continuation of the rhyme scheme, which comes throughout this poem, which is, say, A, B, A, C, B, C. And all that does, it conveys connection, and the fact that there's a continuous rhyme scheme links to the fact that he is unable to change his love of Cynarae. So there's a description of his wild antics, so flinging roses, a traditionally romantic act, roses riotously with the throng, dancing, showing how he's trying to live a full life without her, but ultimately he comes back to thy pale lost lilies, and a lily is a symbol for virginity. And as he reminds us, he can't have fun truly because he's still in love with Cynarae. And we've got this final stanza where he's calling for madder music and stronger wine. I don't know if you can read that. Make it put it back to black just so it's easier to read. Continuing to engage in raucous activities, so music, wine, feast. So he's not letting her get in the way of living his life. But we've got this repetition of therefore, then falls thy shadow, compared to therefore fell thy shadow. So we've moved into the present tense. The fact that this continues, so it's now I am desolate, but the second refrain remains I have been faithful to the Cynarae in my fashion, which suggests perhaps that he is no longer going to be faithful to her, but because of the refrain, because of the rhyme scheme, and because of all the imagery, it suggests that he's still going to be tied up in his love for her. I realised that was quite a quick overview of the poem itself. I hope it's been useful. As I say, stop the video and read my annotations by all means. I hope I managed to get in some context for A3 as well, and thank you.